There are tons of podcasts on the internet where the host is underqualified. This is not one of those podcasts. Mark Skelton has a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in clinical mental health counseling, and currently working on his doctorate in clinical psychology. And he has over 10 years of working in the field of psychology. Qualified. If it's mental health, psychology, empowerment, and self-improvement, he knows his stuff. During this show, you'll learn about general topics of psychology concepts and theories. Everything from neuroscience, psychology of fear, brain foods, psychoanalysis. What is therapy? What is depression? This is the Skelton Report. And this is your host, Mark Nathaniel Skelton.
All right, welcome to the Skelton Report, a podcast for the people. I'm Mark Nathaniel Skelton. Welcome back to the show. I hope all is well. This recent weather change has got me feeling a little sniffle, but we're going to be all right because we got a great show today as we're kicking off the book review for our Exodus series. Let me start off by asking you some very penetrating questions. What do you think the impact of slavery has had on the African American mind when it comes to our views on work, owning property, community division, and personal inferiority? This will be the focus of today's subject matter as we continue the theme, the Exodus series, the psychological study of the liberation and individuation of the black mind. Today's book review, it's a good one. It is Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery by Dr. Na'im Akbar. Dr. Akbar, I'll tell you a little bit about this gentleman. Dr. Akbar is described as one of the world's preeminent African American clinical psychologists, and he is a pioneer in the development of the African-centered approach to modern psychology. He's appeared on PBS, Oprah, The Phil Donahue Show, all that good stuff, affiliated with the University of Michigan, Morehouse College, Norfolk State University, Florida State University. Has many works. I believe that's where he's done a lot of his studying. App. A little disclaimer, and I'm going to use his words, is that myself, Mark Nathaniel Skelton, am neither a spokesman or interpreter of the work of Dr. Na'im Akbar, just a student of truth and seeking truth wherever I may find it. I don't intend to parrot Dr. Akbar's ideas, take full responsibility for any misrepresentation of his work, but the point is, I think it's so important that we share and lift up some of the black thinkers in our community to see how their works can help and apply to our particular situation. So as I'm saying, Dr. Akbar answers some of these questions that I just started off with. How basically has slavery affected us psychologically, and where does that manifest at in our daily lives, in our daily living? So the book, let's get into just a little introduction of the book. You still have time to get it. We're going to walk through the major sections today. We're just going to get through the introduction and give you a purpose of what the book is for. Now, this book is a spinoff from the parent publication entitled Chains and Images of Psychological Slavery. From my understanding, that was originally published in 1976. It's been reissued. And the point is that this one is a little smaller, more readable, and its significance is identifying a wide range of persisting problems which plague the African American community. Once again, research out of California, a review titled Improving the Health of African Americans in the United States of America, an Overdue Opportunity for Social Justice. What sticks out to me here is that it states African Americans in its abstracts remain the least healthy ethnic group in the United States, a somber legacy, years of racial and social injustice, and formidable challenge. So this is, once again, these are the things I don't know about you. I keep hearing. Who wants to keep hearing that? This may help supplement and answer some of the questions why this may be. Once again, we're here for empowerment and improvement. And one thing we have to do is address some of the tough conversations. And this is exactly what this book does. So this book has two main essays within it. One recognizes the psychological functioning and behavior resulting from slavery, and the second is more of a theologically loaded approach, which we're going to save that one. So we won't get into that through this series. We're going to say that for another series that I'm working on that deals more with religion, spirituality, and theology. So for today, once again, we're going to focus more on the psychological component. Dr. Akbar states, is convinced recognizing the origin and the continued manifestation of this psychological bondage is the start of a self-healing process. If you listen to our last show, that's the individuation that needs to take place. Not only freeing ourselves, but healing ourselves. This process, which we as a people must engage in, also covered this in the last show, individually and collectively, not just as an individual, but as a group. We have to do some healing in order for us to get to the proverbial promised land that flows with milk and honey, which is a better state of being. So the three main points that we're going to go through, we're just going to touch on what the introduction basically covers for us, which I think is some points that I want to highlight for us, is the significance of chattel slavery on the mentality of African Americans. Also, what trauma is, PTSD in this sense. And I think as we move forward, we're going to have to touch on Dr. Joy DeGrow's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Awesome book, by the way. By the way, happy Women's History Month for those out there. Shout out to Dr. Joy. And impact, last, but the impact on that, specific examples of impacts on the psychological functioning behavior that this book covers, which we will touch on in future shows, Lord's willing. So let's go ahead and get started with the first point on chattel slavery. All right. Dr. Akbar starts off by stating that slavery is, unfortunately, the modern genesis for African Americans in the Western world. Now, I want to mention that we have a great history before the slavery, as well as a great history afterwards. Okay. But we cannot neglect the fact, and just brief details, of the 300 years of captivity of the African Americans is an indisputable fact, which too many sought to deny, all right, as relevant to anything more than an event of the past. All right. Dr. Akbar states this. He goes on to say that these 300 years serve as the saddest commentary. Listen to what he says. The saddest commentary on man's inhumanity to man. We're talking about from the capture to the Middle Passage trip, to arriving in the Americas, the selling, the raping, the breaking up of families, the emasculation that took place, and on and on. This level of cruelty, Dr. Akbar says, is incomparable to anything recorded in modern history. And this period of history is brutal and morbid and actually arouses vehement hostilities. This is the words they use at the very thought of its occurrences. What's happening within you when you hear about this? This is a show for the people, so I welcome the majority population, the minority population. Dr. George G.M. James in Stolen Legacy makes a good point that everybody has been misinformed. Everybody needs to hear about this information so that we all can heal from what has taken place in our history. And so there's a hesitation to be at this. There's a hesitation to address this topic. There's a lot of anxiety surrounding the conversation on all fronts, the quote unquote majority, the quote unquote minority. As he says, too many sought to deny the relevance of slavery and how it can still play out in the present. Now, I want to insert something here. A little my thought is that we're not making any excuses. This isn't excuse making, but this does need to be addressed and acknowledged. One of the first things that you do as a mental health professional, when you're meeting with the client and you're meeting with the patient, you have to perform a biopsychosocial assessment. That's a starting point. That's where you take a history of the person's family, the person's symptoms, all right, some of their legal history, all these things, educational history. You have to get a checkpoint of where they're at. And in that assessment typically is a section for trauma. Now, if you neglect major trauma in an individual's life during this assessment point, you're doing a major disservice to the client, to the patient, and to yourself and the work. It makes good sense to take a temperature of where individuals at and to really pinpoint some of the trauma and get a narrative of that and a good idea of that for the work. Okay, so it's very important that we talk about this. I also think it's important that we do not, and this is what he says, cast blame on anyone for this. Okay? That's not what we're about either. Dr. Naeem Akbar actually states that the objective of this recognition should not be a process of casting blame. All right, it's clear that he actually puts in here that there were masters and there were slaves. There was captors and captives. The fact speaks for itself. We have to do healing. And he quotes, "We believe that they and their descendants," as referring to the majority population and those who did the capturing, "will require," watch this, "a collective healing as well." I welcome that as well. I think, once again, healing needs to be taking place on all fronts. All right. So what are the lingering effects of the psychological slavery? Well, Dr. Akbar posits that the blemishes of these inhumane conditions persists as a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's the word that was used during the writing of this book. I believe it's now referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder, which is fine, on the collective mind of Africans in America. And though the original cause cannot be altered, so we cannot change history, it's in place, it's static, the genesis in the beginning can be understood. Okay, the qualities of these effects that have been observed in our community and within ourselves fit with this formation of what he calls, and I think it's very deep, being possessed by the ghost of the plantation. Okay? Wow, that's pretty deep. So many people, he goes on to say that many people have identified, so this ghost of the plantation is basically the demons of our past, all right, that have been accepted and thought to be irreversible on the slave mentality. And so what he does is he gives credibility, because once again, we historically as African American people are spiritual, and so this language can be relatable and identified with, and that this ghost of the plantation gives credibility to the reality of mental slavery. He says we do not want to suggest that it is irreversible, neither because of its origins in the past nor because of its collective form. The purpose of this book is that he believes that he wants to help people know that the ghost came where it came from, and that we must destroy this ghost and not give it safe refuge. People in the past has given this ghost of the plantation, and we'll explain that a little more what it is. It's really basically the traumas that's taken place and how it's continually acting out in our life. And this ghost is basically has found refuge in our minds individually and as a community. And many have failed to see this ghost. And then many have failed to challenge the ghost and ridding it from our minds. So the point is, we need to be aware of this ghost of the plantation, quote unquote. And we must not give it refuge in our minds by acting upon some of these things that's taken place to us in the past, but we must eliminate the ghost of the plantation. And so how do we do that? Once again, that's the subject of this book. But I think we need to get a better understanding of connecting some of the symptoms of post-traumatic, as he uses stress syndrome, better known as post-traumatic stress disorder, all right, which gives us a prime opportunity to talk a little bit about the DSM-5. Now, as a mental health professional, this is kind of the Bible of what we use to diagnose an individual with, disorder, or taking a look at the symptoms, meeting the criteria, and its impact on African American psychology. So this book gives examples of the persisting slavery-based behaviors which remain. This is the idea of the ghost of the plantation operating in our life. And it's absolutely important to acknowledge the realities of slavery and do what we mentioned in the last show, confront these realities after we acknowledge them. This is the individuation process that allows healing to take place, and see the impact of this historical trauma on our collective minds as a people. We have to acknowledge that this is going on. We are dealing with this. Once again, as pop culture knows, in AA groups, the first step is acknowledging that something's going on before you can conquer it, and not pressing it out of our conscious thought and our conscious mind, but accepting what's going on and conquering it. So post-traumatic stress disorder, remember when I mentioned taking that trauma, and just because you experience trauma doesn't mean you have PTSD, but I think it's just for your knowledge that there is a clinical definition, and it's underneath the trauma and stress related disorders. This is a real thing. It typically is the result of exposure to an actual or threatening event, so death, serious injury, sexual violence, and how it manifests, in present day. And like I said, so we're kind of disconnecting right now from the slavery talk and just more for what is PTSD, and that, soldiers suffer from this a lot. Once again, anytime you've seen something could be traumatic to you and not to me. So it's individualized as well. But you're dealing with it when you have recurrent or intrusive and distressing memories of it, of the event that took place, flashbacks, distress to stimuli that remind you of the event, changes in your physiological realm, so how your body responds to something that reminds you of the traumatic event. Typically, you can have a negative mood, nightmares. And the point I'm making is that an individual can have a lasting impact on their lives if they don't deal with it. That's the thing. I worked with plenty of clients that have had trauma in the past. Sometimes they didn't even know, that's the point. They didn't even know it was trauma until we did a psychoeducation on what trauma is and how it plays out in their life. And so the same thing could be true, once again, as we're exploring this as a people and as a group. The same can be true for us individually and us collectively when it comes and pertains to the impact, the traumatic impact. No one would argue that slavery was not traumatic, and the impact that it has had on us as a people. And so what Dr. Akbar is highlighting in his introduction as we get into the book is that the slavery has resulted, the physical slavery and the trauma from that has resulted in mental slavery. As cruel and painful as chattel slavery was, that was the owning of people as property, chattel slavery, it could be exceeded only by, and this is what he says in his introduction, by a worse form of slavery. The slavery that captures the mind and imprisons the motivation perceptions, aspirations, and identity in a web, watch this, of anti-self images, generating a personal and collective self-destruction is more cruel than the shackles of the wrist and of the ankles. This type of slavery that feeds on the mind and invades the soul and destroys his and her loyalties to himself or herself, establishing allegiance to forces which destroy himself or herself, is an even worse form of capture. Wow, this is deep. So the point that he's making is that we have to go beyond the simple recognition of the trauma. Okay, we got to go back to that. See, the slavery that he's talking about now is the one in the mind. Okay. And what we have to do is we have to go beyond simply recognizing this trauma. That's why I share some of the PTSD. This is a real thing that does happen to people. And what we're proposing, and that's why I really want to get into Dr. Joy DeGrow's book eventually, is that we're proposing that this has been passed down generationally. This is the ghost of the plantation. And we must begin the process of healing our minds so that we can free ourselves from the slavery mentality. And this is where we come into liberation. Okay? Dr. Akbar states, and we're closing on this point, that the last remaining obstacle to the complete mental liberation of the African American mind, once again, this goes to the title, The Black Mind, is failure to release ourselves from slavery. Wow. So if we continue to go about as we have been, this is why the theme of the Exodus I'm using is, if we just keep wandering in the wilderness and we don't purge ourselves and create a new mentality, we'll never enter into the land that we need to in a better position in life. And so one major thing that we have to address, I think, individually and as a people, as a mental health provider that identifies with the Black community, is some of the trauma that has taken place and some of the lack of healing that we have done on a collective and a mass level. Once again, the Exodus, the mass departure. On a mass level, we have to address some of these chains that are still bound upon our minds mentally from what took place in slavery, deconstruction, civil rights, all these things. And I feel like we as a group, as a people, we have to start doing this. And so let me introduce you to some of the psychological, he calls them the psychological legacy of slavery. And what he goes into, and will be the subject matters of the next show. So all we have for time for today is just the introduction, just whetting your appetite. All right. This is just the peanuts that they bring out for you when you go to a restaurant before we get to the meal. So basically, work. One of the attitudes which has been passed to us from slavery is the rather distorted African American attitude towards work. This is what he goes over in his book. All right. We'll do a episode on that. Property. The slaves were permitted to own nothing or little property. So this slavery mentality plays out, this ghost of the plantation plays out in these areas. Leadership. Probably one of the most destructive influences which has grown out of slavery is the disrespect of African American leadership. I think that should be another episode. This one makes you think. The clown. Another popular character which has its origin in slavery is the African American clown. Always entertaining. It's okay to be funny, but it's not okay to be an intellectual. Wow, this is going to be deep. Dr. Jawanza does a lot of work on that too. Personal inferiority. Let us consider another one of the most destructive characteristics from slavery is personal inferiority. We might have to visit some Dr. Alfred Adler's writings on this. Community division is another one, right? The point of this discussion is that slavery has had and continues to have a devastating effect on the personalities of African American people and how we connect with one another. Division. The family. Probably the most serious effect of all was the impact that slavery has had on African American family. and color discrimination will be the last one. So we're gonna pick through those, pick some top ones, and kind of dissect those and share them, and then the book goes into the liberation. So what we need to do from how to liberate from mental slavery. So we'll walk through these. I want you to join me, walk with me. Who will come with me? Oh, who will come and go with me, as the hymn says. And we will see what we can get from this as we are working on, once again, it's going to be a process on the individuation and the healing process that we got to have these conversations. So, it's been a good show. We went over the introduction. You still have time to get his book. I have it. I got it. It's on Amazon. It's under $20 new. You can even get a used one for $11. I encourage you to get the book so we can walk along together and dissect this book out together and see how we can use it to help us. All right. I'll catch you on the next go around. Have a great week. I'll catch you next Monday. Peace.
You've been listening to the Skelton Report. Mark is an expert in mental health, psychology, empowerment, and self-improvement. This show is informative about science, research, and literature within professional psychology. If it's neuroscience, psychology of fear, brain foods, psychoanalysis, diving in depth about therapy and depression, and speaking to stigmas and issues within the minority and church communities. It's all here. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we hope you got some practical and useful information. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Skelton_Neuro. Check out the website at SkeltonNeuroCounseling.com. And if you have questions or comments, email Mark at SkeltonNeuroscience@gmail.com. Till next time, this is the Skelton Report, signing off for now.